In the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, one of Rome's most powerful men met an end so grotesque that it would haunt the empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, had built his fortune upon the backs of others, through fire sales of Sulla's prescriptions, real estate seized from the desperate, and slave labor on an unimaginable scale. He possessed everything: money, influence, and a place in the ruling Triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. Yet none of it satisfied him. The one thing he could not buy was respect, and in Rome, respect came only through blood and conquest. At 60 years old, an age when most men would have basked in their fortune and sought the comforts of retirement, Crassus burned with a humiliating truth. Caesar was conquering Gaul. Pompey had swept the Mediterranean of pirates and claimed triumphs beyond compare, and he, Crassus, was still seen as a banker among warriors, a coin counter, not a commander. The sting of being called the third wheel of the Triumvirate gnawed at him constantly. He could not bear to die remembered as merely the richest man in Rome. He wanted to be a legend, and so he turned his eyes eastward, toward a kingdom that shimmered in the Roman imagination like a mirage of endless wealth. Parthia, stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus. It controlled the lucrative silk and spice routes that bound the ancient world together. To Crassus, conquering Parthia was the golden key, a campaign that would eclipse Pompey, rival Caesar, and flood Rome with riches so vast that even his immense fortune would seem modest. Gold had made him powerful. Gold would now win him glory. But there was a problem. The Senate distrusted him. They denied him the traditional declaration of war, suspecting, as they were right to, that his motives were less about Rome and more about his own pride. Crassus ignored them. In 55 BCE, he arrived in Syria as governor, already dreaming of his triumphal parade. There, he began assembling one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever sent eastward. 7 legions of nearly 40,000 men, 4,000 cavalry, and an equal number of light infantry. And at his side marched his son, Publius, young, brave, and already a decorated warrior under Caesar in Gaul. To Crassus, this was more than a war. It was a dynasty in the making. Father and son would carve their names into history together. The invasion began in the spring of 53 BCE. Roman forces crossed the Euphrates at Zeugma, their standards glinting in the sunlight. Early victories came easily. Local settlements surrendered without a fight, others crumbled under the weight of Roman siegecraft. The flat Mesopotamian plains seemed perfectly suited to Rome's heavy infantry, who had crushed countless enemies before. Intelligence even suggested that King Orodes II of Parthia was distracted by rebellion. Everything looked as if fortune was smiling on Crassus. But what seemed like weakness was in fact a trap. Parthian general Surena, barely 30 years old, yet already a master strategist, had studied the Roman way of war. He understood what Crassus did not, that Rome's rigid discipline, its heavy armor, and its thirst for a decisive clash could all be turned into weaknesses. So he lured them deeper into the desert, away from their supplies, and into a killing ground where Parthia's cavalry ruled supreme. The Parthian army was unlike anything Rome had faced. There were no chaotic barbarian charges, no disorganized rabble to scatter with legionary steel. This was a sophisticated force, built on mobility, endurance, and terror. Its 2 arms were the heavily armored cataphracts, thundering shock cavalry covered in scales of iron, and the elusive horse archers, who could strike from astonishing distances and melt away before a counterattack. Worse still, Surena had prepared massive camel caravans laden with arrows. His archers would never run dry. At first, Roman morale held. Legionaries scoffed at distant horsemen darting across the dunes, but day after day, the harassment continued. Scouts appeared like phantoms on the horizon, then vanished. Supply lines were cut in the night. Convoys disappeared into sand and silence. Soldiers swore they heard hoofbeats in the darkness. Sleep became scarce. The desert, once imagined as the road to riches, now felt like a vast, suffocating prison. Crassus pressed on, too proud to admit error. Yet he began to sense what he had refused to believe. The tactics that had brought Rome victory across the Mediterranean were useless here. His infantry, invincible in forests and plains, stumbled in the heat. His cavalry, too few and too poorly trained for this kind of war, could not match the endless tide of Parthian horsemen. The very air seemed to whisper that Rome did not belong in this land. The breaking point came at Carrhae, a small city in northern Mesopotamia. Here, Crassus believed he would finally face Surena in the decisive battle he had craved. On June 9th, 53 BCE, the Roman army drew up in their traditional lines, infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, light troops ahead. Crassus stood at the center, while Publius commanded the right flank. To any observer, it was the image of Roman invincibility, polished armor, eagle standards gleaming, the machine of conquest ready to crush another foe. Then the Parthians appeared. No infantry, no ponderous formations, only waves of cavalry gliding like shadows across the desert floor. The cataphracts gleamed like statues of iron, while thousands of horse archers encircled the Romans in a deadly halo. At Surena's signal, the sky darkened. Arrows rained down, a storm of death that did not end after a single volley, but continued hour after hour. Roman shields, built for close combat, were pierced again and again. Men screamed, fell, bled into the sand. In the midst of this nightmare, Publius saw what looked like opportunity. Eager to prove himself, he led his cavalry in a desperate charge against the Parthian center. It was exactly what Surena wanted. The cataphracts absorbed the blow, and the horse archers closed in from all sides. Publius and his men were surrounded, cut off, and slaughtered. The young commander fought valiantly to the end, but his death was made into theater. Surena's men severed his head, mounted it on a spear, and paraded it before the Roman lines. Imagine the scene. A father, broken and helpless, watching the mutilated head of his son sway above the enemy ranks. For Crassus, it was not only the death of his heir, but the death of his last shred of pride. From that moment, the Roman lines wavered. Legionaries who had once marched with iron discipline now faltered. Panic spread. Water was running out, the wounded lay screaming, and every attempt to break through was repelled with merciless precision. The desert sun scorched down, turning armor into ovens and sand into fire. That night, Crassus attempted retreat, but retreat became chaos. Soldiers abandoned equipment, abandoned comrades, even abandoned hope. Thousands collapsed in the sand, never to rise again. Others were cut down by the Parthians as they fled in blind terror. By dawn, the once mighty Roman force had been reduced to a shattered mob, staggering into Carrhae. Half their army lay dead or lost. Their banners were gone. Their commander, who had dreamed of glory, was now a broken man drowning in grief and shame. Crassus had demanded a decisive battle, and he had gotten one. But it was a decision written in blood, and Rome had paid the price. The survivors who stumbled into Carrhae were no longer Rome's proud legions. They were a horde of broken men, hollow-eyed, dragging themselves forward through dust and despair. For Crassus, the dream was over. His son was gone, half his army destroyed, and the golden triumph he had promised now lay in ruins. Yet still, he clung to one last hope that negotiations might salvage something from the disaster. Parthian general Surena, a master not only of war but of spectacle, understood this desperation. He sent envoys beneath flags of truce, offering to discuss terms of withdrawal. To many Romans, the offer seemed like mercy. To Crassus's officers, it smelled of treachery. They begged him not to trust the enemy, to fight on, to preserve what dignity remained. But Crassus, shattered by grief and blinded by desperation, agreed. He needed to believe that some kind of honorable resolution was still possible. The meeting was set on neutral ground between the two armies. Crassus rode out with a small retinue of officers, each step of his horse heavy with foreboding. Some ancient accounts claim a quarrel broke out. Others suggest treachery was planned from the start. Whatever the truth, violence erupted. Parthian soldiers seized the Roman delegation, overpowered them, and dragged Crassus into captivity. Thus, the richest man in Rome, who had once commanded the destiny of thousands, now stood powerless in the hands of his enemies. For Surena and the Parthian nobles, Crassus was more than a prisoner. He was the embodiment of Roman arrogance, a man who had invaded without provocation, motivated not by necessity but by greed. To them, a simple execution would not suffice. His death had to carry meaning. It had to be a punishment that reflected his crimes, a warning to Rome and a message to the world. And so, they chose gold, the very thing Crassus had worshipped all his life. Parthian craftsmen heated the precious metal until it became a molten liquid, glowing white-hot, more like fire than metal. It hissed and spat in the crucibles, a substance both beautiful and terrifying. In that shimmering heat lay the perfect irony. Gold, symbol of wealth and power, now transformed into an instrument of torture. Before an assembly of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers, Crassus was forced to his knees. Soldiers held his arms and pried open his mouth. He struggled, but there was no escape. No grand speech, no final plea for Rome. His words were stolen before they could leave his throat. The molten gold was poured. Witnesses say it seared his lips and tongue before rushing down his throat, burning flesh, charring organs, turning his insides into a furnace. The agony must have been beyond comprehension, heat so intense that it consumed from within. Crassus, the man who had hoarded wealth above all else, now felt its true nature. Beauty masking destruction, treasure becoming torment. The Parthians watched in silence, then in grim satisfaction, as the richest man in Rome was consumed by the very thing he loved most. For them, it was not cruelty alone, it was justice, poetic and precise. The execution was both a punishment and a theater of meaning, a spectacle crafted to echo across generations. Rome's enemies understood symbolism as well as steel. In their culture, honor was measured not by wealth but by courage and restraint. To them, Crassus embodied everything corrupt about Roman expansion: arrogance, greed, exploitation. His grotesque end was the perfect inversion of his life. The mouth that had boasted of conquest was silenced with molten gold. The throat that had spoken of Rome's destiny was reduced to ashes. News of his death spread quickly. When it reached Rome, panic followed. For centuries, Rome had cultivated the myth of invincibility. The Republic had crushed Carthage, Macedon, countless tribes. Yet here, In the deserts of the East, Rome had been humiliated, an entire army annihilated, their commander executed in a manner so grotesque it seemed ripped from myth. The illusion of Roman superiority cracked. Politically, the consequences were catastrophic. The Triumvirate Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus was no more. Without Crassus's wealth to balance the scales, Caesar and Pompey turned from uneasy allies into bitter rivals. Within years, civil war engulfed Rome, and the Republic itself would crumble. Ironically, in dying, Crassus set in motion the very collapse he had hoped to prevent by seeking glory abroad. The Parthians did not waste the symbolism. Crassus's severed head was allegedly sent to King Orodes II, who used it in theatrical performances of Euripides' Bacchae. In these plays, the head of Crassus became the prop of a tragic figure destroyed by his own hubris, a grotesque blend of entertainment and mockery. Roman defeat was not just remembered, it was reenacted for laughter and scorn. Meanwhile, many Roman survivors of Carrhae were not executed. Instead, they were resettled in distant corners of the Parthian Empire. Some became mercenaries, others farmers. Over time, they melted into local communities, living out their days as exiles. Their survival stood in stark contrast to their commander's fate, a reminder that mercy was reserved for those who had no choice, but not for the man who had chosen war out of greed. Historians ever since have debated the exact details of Crassus's execution. Was molten gold truly poured into his throat, or was it a symbolic tale invented by later writers to embody his greed? The truth may never be known, but in a way, it hardly matters. The story endures because it conveys a deeper truth, that unchecked ambition and lust for wealth can consume a man more completely than any enemy's sword. The battlefield of Carrhae itself has yielded grim reminders. Fragments of Roman armor, weapons, and bones unearthed from the sand tell the story of annihilation. Manuals of Roman warfare were later revised, trying to learn from this disaster, yet no correction could erase the humiliation. Rome would remember Carrhae as one of its darkest defeats, and the death of Crassus as one of its most grotesque. And still, the image of molten gold poured into his throat echoes across centuries. To his contemporaries, it was a moral lesson. To later philosophers like Plutarch, it was the ultimate allegory of greed punished. To us today, it remains a warning. The things we desire most intensely can become the instruments of our destruction. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, sought to buy himself glory with blood and conquest. Instead, he purchased only horror. His legacy is not one of triumph, but of torment, a caution etched into history with molten gold. The golden throat that silenced him still whispers to us across the ages. Beware the hunger that can never be fed. For when wealth becomes worship, it does not save, it devours.